As I point out in the slide, don't be fooled. This is really a work about historical legacy, not necessarily Puritanism. Everybody loves to read Scarlet Letter, and then they come and read The House of the Seven Gables, and they say, oh, Hawthorne loves to talk about and write about Puritanism. And they look at things like Young Goodman Brown and the Minister's Black Veil and everything. And yes, he was very, very interested in using history as a canvas. We talked about that last time when we talked about My Kinsman Major Molyneux. But don't be fooled. This is not a commentary necessarily on Puritanism. Everybody loves to read into that, and they have some very mistaken notions about his attitude towards his Puritan ancestors as a result of that. But in essence, instead, really, the romance brings up an issue for Hawthorne, which is the question of historical legacy. More precisely, he's interested in exploring the question of how our ancestral past shapes our circumstances and whether it determines our fate. Now, naturally, we have the legacy of the pensions and malls in this. We also have the larger question of the nation's Puritan heritage, something that's been brought up from time to time throughout the work. But notice how much attention is put on the families and the characters. You remember my point about how Nathaniel Hawthorne often simply uses Puritan history as a backdrop? You can hardly argue that this work is about Puritanism. It's really about these families and the legacy that's passed on from one to the other. Now, we'll also bring up a couple of other things, but before we do that, we're going to be talking about heredity and regeneration in just a moment. Let me just take a back step here and talk about how he's really also trying to blend the Gothic and the sentimental seduction tradition. Now, we've got a male character who is in a position to woo, possibly even seduce, for nefarious purposes. The female character, we got that with Matthew Maule and Alice Pynchon, and how he can sort of weave a spell over her and control her. There's not a sexual thing really, sort of an overt sexual thing here, but there is kind of this male female sentimental kind of, even the style is kind of this sentimental sort of style to it, and it also is kind of this love story between Holgrave and Phoebe that eventually comes around to full fruition, and the happy ending and all of that kind of thing. So that's in there. But there's the Gothic as well, the house and the ghosts and the ghostly things and the curse and the hidden fortune, the hidden sorts of stuff that that everybody wants to know, where's the hidden treasure. So he's trying to bring the Gothic and the sentimental seduction tradition together, trying for something new here. He didn't do that in the Scarlet Letter, really. There he's really dealing more with the variation on the sentimental seduction tradition. Nothing there with the mystical, the ghostly, the kinds of things that we normally associate with the Gothic. Well, a couple of the major themes in the piece that we want to explore here. First, this question of heredity and regeneration. Boy, you'd have to be asleep at the wheel not to notice that that was a major thing in the novel. It's talked about all the time. Remember that in the 19th century really was an era when enormous strides in the biological sciences were made. Darwin, germ theory, microbiology, etc. It's no wonder really that an intellectual such as Hawthorne would be interested in some of the newer ideas. Louis Agassiz, for example, who was a professor of biology there at Harvard, had some notions that were generally, or were gradually being abandoned, I should say, in favor of more modern ideas. He had this kind of notion that stuff, life came from sort of the spontaneous generation notion, and because people didn't know where flies came from, for example. I mean, they knew where maggots came from, but they didn't know where sort of things popped up from. I mean, where did this life cycle of an animal begin and end, and these kinds of things? People were just beginning to look at that. What the 18th century was to the physical sciences, and by that I mean physics, like Newton and these guys. The 19th century really was for biological sciences. It wasn't until really after the Civil War that people began to really embrace germ theory, for example. This notion that there are these organisms that you can't see that actually can infect you or can cause all of these diseases. Microbiology just was something that people in the earlier part of the century didn't know anything about. But the century, as it went on, the real exciting stuff in the sciences were taking place in the biological sciences. And of course, Darwin is our main guy for that. Everyone knew the old explanations didn't really work anymore, but a newer understanding of life and its forces was still sort of on the horizon and hadn't come about until the end of the century. By the end of the century, people pretty much knew what was what in terms of germ theory and infections and these kinds of things. That's why in the Civil War, most of the people who died from amputations didn't die from the amputation itself. They died from the infection because they didn't sterilize, they didn't sanitize. But during the Civil War, sanitary commissions came along. They didn't understand microbiology, but they did know that if you stopped doing what had been done and you decided to have a clean operating table and clean your stuff, then people lived. They didn't know why people lived, but they did know that people lived. So there's this growing consciousness of the biological sciences that are going on, and part of that, of course, is heredity, studies of heredity and regeneration. Gregor Mendel, for example, is doing his stuff in terms of heredity and genetics and things like this during the 1860s. Hawthorne is obviously interested in the issue of heredity in this piece. Repeatedly throughout the novel, the subject of isolation of the Pynchon family, for example, we get started with that, and by extension other upper class families is addressed. These families atrophy, as I said, due to a lack of interaction with other classes. And in the case of the Pynchons, the narrator even mentions Phoebe's non-aristocratic parents as being fresh blood into the family. Now, mixed into the discussion of heredity and exclusivity is this political social message, it seems, if I'm reading this correctly, I think I have, in that the aristocratic exclusivity of some of the families is particularly inappropriate, it's archaic in this new world, it doesn't fit into this new democracy. The new democratic progressive society in the United States calls for a commingling of these classes. It's a Puritan holdover. It's an aristocratic holdover. The Pynchon family is. And it is a ruthlessly leveling new society. The Pynchons are simply passed by as the world goes on without them. They become as much as of an oddity as their little withered, shriveled up, shrimpy chickens. So there's something at play here as you look at what Hawthorne's trying to do here. You can see him kind of struggling and groping around with trying to formulate some sort of position here that's kind of nationalistic, but it's nationalistic in a new sort of way. Hawthorne is saying, look, Europe is old, it's passé. The future of humankind is not aristocracy, that's the past. The new world is going to have a new society, and these class distinctions are just not going to carry as much weight as they once did. Remember that this is an era also that's not just interested in the biological sciences, is also interested in the issue of class. Over in Britain, they're wondering how in the world do we dismantle this aristocratic social structure that we've had for so long and implement something that celebrates the rights of all people of all classes. Marx is struggling with the question of class in the 1840s and 50s. So this is not something that's out of step at all with what's going on. It's just a different kind of take on it. Now, another theme that's really important, and it's kind of linked to this, hip and jowl, if you will, is this burden of family legacy or history. So obviously Hawthorne deals with this, but let's extrapolate a little bit from this. What's he really getting at? Sure, there's the ostensible moral that he offers in the preface about one generation not piling up wealth and heaping it upon the next for fear that the younger generation turns out to be about as useless, and that's pretty much how he puts it, as Hepzibah and Clifford, for example. You don't want to have you don't want your descendants to be a bunch of Hepzibahs and a bunch of Cliffords. Lots of scholars have read that as a rather grudging moral, as though Hawthorne were saying, you want a moral? All right, here's one that's as good as the next. So when he writes that in the preface, you have to say, does he really mean it, or is he just kind of saying, okay, I got to have a moral to the novel, so here it is, but I don't really mean it. He wasn't big on these traditional didactic sorts of tales. He really wanted you to look deeper. Frequently, the tales don't have a moral. They have different points to make that deal with questions of morality. So that's why I was saying back with the Scarlet Letter, when your high school English teacher said it's all about don't diddle around with people you're not supposed to be diddling around with. That's a little too simplistic. Hawthorne had an ostensible moral there, a sort of a public surface level moral of, yes, do not have adulterous sex with your minister. But you can hardly say the novel was just about that. I mean, that's what you kind of want to say if you live in the Bible Belt in the South, in Texas or what have you, and you're teaching 11th grade English. But at the same time, the novel is considerably more complex and deals with some very complex, multifaceted, multi-layered ethical questions. And this is no different. The House of the Seven Gables is no different. It's not quite as dark, but it certainly is as complex, I think, in many respects. But I think you can look also at the work as one that kind of foreshadows the coming prosperity of the nation as a whole. And if you consider it from that vantage point, it really is a cautionary tale. This cannot be a nation of pensions. It must be a nation of pensions and malls together, blended. After all, that's exactly what we get with Holgrave and Phoebe. No, a subtext of the work then might well be the issue of how the nation, given its history, will develop in terms of social class and privilege. You know, Hawthorne, if you see it this way, as I think you can see it this way, it seems to be a populist and a progressive. Holgrave is clearly as autobiographical in some degree as Phoebe is of Hawthorne's own wife. As I said, his nickname for her was Phoebe, and so you guessed it. But is he trying to say not just something about our past and how we ended up being the way we are, but is he also giving us a recipe, a formula for or a basis for constructing a successful society going forward? That is, that we can't have classes of people. There's no formula. There's no political statement in here that I can see that's overt. This is not a Marxist text, but you can read it as a Marxist would read it if you want. But at the same time, is he trying to make a bigger, broader point about class structure in the later 19th century and going forward? He had evidently, I think, something to say about politics indirectly in My Kinsman Major Molyneux. I don't want to make him into a political writer. I don't think he was, but I think he certainly had some views on that point. So these themes are very, very important and quite essential. I wanted to show you that little spot down there when Hawthorne married Sophia, his wife. They moved into a house that belonged to Emerson's grandfather, Ezra Stiles. It's called the Old Manse, and it's there in Concord today. And over in the window there, cute little thing, they carved with her engagement ring into the window pane several different sayings and their names and the year and all of this kind of stuff. And if you visit the Old Manse, which you can, it's open to the public, you'll go up to the bedroom and you see that little thing. Most of the tourists walk right by it. It's kind of a shame, but it's there and it's interesting. In the next slide, we'll talk about the themes that deal not necessarily with society, not necessarily with regeneration and heredity and these sorts of things are the big issues, but we're also going to talk about how important the themes dealing with individuals and their relationships are.